Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our live webinar of September. My name is Boudaud. I'm a senior consultant for Brandwood CKC. I'm also joined today by Yervant Chijian.
Good morning, all.
We receive more and more queries from companies that develop software and who require guidance on whether their product is a medical device or not, and when it is, the sort of regulatory framework that applies to their device. So in this month's webinar, we'll cover some of the key elements of the regulation for software as medical devices and talk through some of the associated regulatory framework. So just a very quick introduction if you don't know us. So we're a regulatory, quality and commercialization consultancy headquartered in Sydney. We've been serving companies of all sizes, both locally and internationally, for over 20 years. You may have known us in the past as Brandwood Biomedical. However, in July this year, we've merged with our long-term partners and pharma expert, Capital K Consulting, to form together Brandwood CKC. So we now have a consolidated team of consultants that can cover all therapeutic areas, medical devices, in vitro diagnosis, and pharmaceutical. We also have offices around the globe and provide an expanded range of services in all those therapeutic areas and diagnostics. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. At the bottom of your screen, you should access a control bar, and there is a Q&A button that you can click on. If you do click on this Q&A button, we will receive some of your questions as we move along, and we'll leave some time at the end of this webinar to basically answer those questions. We did receive a number of questions ahead of time, so thank you very much for everyone who sent their question through. We'll obviously prioritize our responses to those questions and leave some time as much as possible to answer additional questions as they come along. If we haven't had a chance to respond to all of your questions in the given time of this webinar, we'll publish a response paper together with a link of this webinar from our website. So this is our agenda for the day. We'll start with providing a bit of a context for software as medical devices. We'll run through some key definitions that surround this topic, talk about the current software or standalone software regulatory environment, look into the regulations of software as medical devices, quality management systems, clinical evidence, and we'll move on to some key takeaways and conclusions. And leave, as I mentioned before, some time for questions at the end. So let's start with some context. Obviously, software as medical device is a bit of a hot topic, and some of the reasons why software as medical devices have a lot of attention from regulators is simply because the regulations have been written a long time ago. There's been a very quick evolution in the technologies, the computing technologies, which has obviously evolved faster than the regulations. So there's a shift really from a range of medical devices that were initially really hardware incorporating software to now a technology where smart standalone software are becoming more of the norm. There's obviously also an increase of platforms where the software can be operated, such as smartphones, tablets, broad access to cloud, which means that people, like individuals, can actually access more and more those kind of medical devices. Obviously, connected care is also one of the trends in medtech. And this also, raises questions as to whether some of those platforms and software products, become medical devices or not. So it's really increasingly difficult to clearly interpret and delineate when a software product fits into the medical device framework, and that's what we're going to try to share some light with you today. So what are the key regulatory challenges that basically are triggered from those evolving technologies? Well, first of all, as I'm quite stating the obvious here, software is of non-physical nature, and so that brings some unique challenges within the regulations. There's some typical questions that have been tried to be addressed through regulations and various guidance documents, which we'll talk about in a moment. But essentially, those are: what forms a software medical device and what product becomes regulated, who can develop a medical device and potentially become a legal manufacturer, how to restrict access to certain users, who should use the device, as in an end user, a layperson, a professional of the healthcare industry, how to evaluate software in terms of socio-technical risks and determine clinical data requirements, how to control software specification through its life cycle. So there's, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but obviously certain functions, can alter the risk classification, the interpretation of whether the product forms a medical device or not. It raises issues with compatibility with platforms as the entire system basically is evolving. So sort of the framework of our presentation today rotates around 4 key topics which have been at the center of the regulatory effort. And here are 4 key documents which have been published by the INDRF, which is the International Forum of Regulators. And so this really shows essentially where the effort, most of the effort has been put from the regulator over the years to develop a regulatory framework around software as medical devices. Obviously, the first key topic is around the definitions for software as medical devices. A second key element is risk management, so possible frameworks for risk categorization and corresponding considerations such as clinical evidence, for example. Quality system and software development. So this is all to do with software life cycles and application of management systems for the development of software products, and obviously clinical evidence. I'll let Yervant introducing some of the key definitions.
Thank you, Jean. Yeah, it's a very important starting point to understanding software as a medical device or standalone software. I guess with the explosion of various healthcare targeted products, the main challenge is knowing if your software is a medical device or not, especially given the availability of a multitude of technology platforms, as well as increasing ease of access and distribution of software created for medical purposes to be used to make clinical decisions and sometimes non-medical purposes. It is important to understand the distinction between software as a medical device and general medical device software, and also software as a medical device versus consumer products. This distinction is based on the intended purpose of and the claims of the software. If it has a medical purpose, that is, it is used to make clinical decisions, then the software is a software as a medical device or standalone software. Otherwise, it can be consumer product. So when does a software product become a standalone software medical device? The distinction between software as a medical device and other software products is if it meets the definition of a medical device. That is, if it will be used for diagnosis or screening, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of disease. Again, this software intended use or claims determine if it meets the medical device definition, sorry. There are several issues with medical device intended use, particularly with software as a medical device, which can impact on the device classification and regulatory status or pathways. They're usually explicit in the product labeling instructions for use, and they are clear and well-defined. However, they can also be implicit. They can be determined from the software feature set, data presentation, expected or known use in the field, or by the significance criticality of the information provided. Lastly, and more specifically to software, is that they can change over time. This is a very important consideration, as it can have significant impact to the regulatory status. Particularly true for software as a medical device, as they have tendency to evolve due to its flexibility to change, especially when it's not dependent on proprietary hardware. Therefore, it is important to evaluate the software as a medical device classification to determine how it can benefit the patient, and if the software generates new information that influences or supports medical care. Briefly, it's also important to mention the differences between general medical device software and software as a medical device or standalone software. If the software is part of a system which includes medical device hardware intended to be used with the software by the manufacturer, then it is medical device software. For example, embedded software, programmable electrical medical systems, control systems, desktop apps that interface with a piece of hardware. So the term software as a medical device is defined as software intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. It is software that is standalone. There is no hardware required to use the software as intended, except for the platform. Though there's a distinction between software as a medical device and medical device software, the regulatory processes are similar. Here we have presented several examples of software that may fit within the definition of a software as a medical device, and some that are unlikely to be standalone software. Each software and product is unique and needs to be assessed case by case to consider all the factors. Those that are likely to be software as a medical device are things such as rehab software, which provides measures of change in mobility and posture, desktop software to detect and track sleep disorder breathing, mobile app that analyzes patient information and physiological parameters, for example, heart rate, blood pressure, to determine a treatment plan, or a mobile phone app to detect melanoma. Those that are unlikely to be software as a medical device are software used in manufacturing of a medical device and which has no therapeutic purpose, software used to statistically evaluate clinical study results, registers, health coaches and lifestyle apps, including databases that help maintain a healthy lifestyle, and software for reimbursement, resource management, such as staff and patient visit scheduling, or other non-medical purposes. I now hand it over back to Jean, who discussed the regulatory environment for software as a medical device.
Thanks, Yervant. So in terms of the regulatory environment, there's one of the big items for consideration, obviously, for medical devices is the classification. There is currently a difference in the software classification between jurisdictions, which is highlighted here in this slide. Under the old medical device directive in Europe and under the current Health Canadian and Australian regulations, as you may be aware, the classification of medical device is mostly based on physical interaction with the device. So when we try to classify a device and we run through the classification rules, it's more so a matter of type of contact with the patient, duration of that contact, invasiveness, and so on and so forth. And by following those rules, most of the software as medical devices end up being classified as low or moderate risks, so typically class 1 or 2A. And so as the functionalities of software as medical devices evolve, those rules less and less reflect an interpretation of the actual device risk level. And we'll talk about some of the changes which are happening in the regulation to accommodate that. The first jurisdiction to have moved in this direction is Europe. And under the MDR, there is now a clear contrast in the classification of software as medical devices. There's really, I would say, a clear now consideration of those kind of products with various classifications that are clearly stated, really from class 1 to class 3, depending on the intended use and the way the product is being used, the nature of the disease, etc., etc. So, as I mentioned in just recently, so there are clearer requirements now for software products in the EU MDR. So there's more definitions around software. So what forms a software as a medical device? There's a recognition that software is an active product, an active device. They've included new chapters and rules for classification of software, which are based on the framework that was established by the IMDRF. There's special labeling requirements, specific risk management considerations, including for interoperability, application of unique device identifier for software. So how do we basically, provide the UDI in the context of a non-physical product and including in the context of a change to the software. And obviously there's some inclusions for development lifecycle and mentions of how to treat information security, mobile computing platforms, etc. In Europe, sorry, in Australia and Canada, there have been some consultations recently. The consultation in Australia, I think, was closed in March this year. Nevertheless, even though those changes have not been formally implemented yet in the regulatory framework, guidance documents provide the view of the regulator as it stands. So both Australia and Canada have released those consultations. They're available online. They're specifically focused on software as medical devices. And as I mentioned before, they represent the current thinking of the regulator. So we highly encourage software developers and manufacturers of potential medical devices to consult those guidance documents as they will facilitate a transition to potential changes in the regulation. In the USA, there also has been a lot of work done by the FDA on software or standalone software as medical devices. And the most relevant program which has been worked on is what's called the pre-certification program. So it's a program that's being currently evaluated by the FDA. Manufacturers can volunteer to participate in a phase that's a test plan for the implementation of this program. There are some strict selection. There's a strict selection criteria and availability for manufacturers to participate. But nevertheless, you know, participation of manufacturers will shape the future of the regulation. Therefore, you know, if you are eligible, we highly encourage you to participate in this program. It's likely that the formal kickoff of this program will be towards the end of 2020. As I mentioned, this program is still under evaluation. The aim of this program is basically to provide a framework for the classification of software under the risk categorization that's been established by the RNDRF. Which based on the type of functionalities of the software and the type of disease that the software is affecting, provide a type of review to be undertaken in the pre-market phase. So the whole idea of this program is basically to rely on a total product lifecycle approach as opposed to simply essentially going through a pre-market phase application to present, you know, what's the risk model for the software. So watch this space. In terms of so these were really the current trends in the regulation. So if you've determined that your software is a medical device, obviously the software or hardware would be regulated in a very similar fashion. So what that means is that, as you might be well aware, there are, we've presented here as examples, two main regulatory framework, one of which was developed under the old GHGF framework, and which really you know, encompasses regulations such as Australia, Canada, Europe, and other jurisdictions, Japan, for example, and on the other hand, the US. So differences and commonalities are presented here. I'm not going to go through the entire list, but essentially, you know, there's different kinds of ways of classifying medical devices. And one of the frameworks, the GHGF framework, really relies on the compliance with a set of essential requirements for safety and effectiveness, as opposed to predications or clinical experience for the demonstration of safety and effectiveness. So the IMDRF, as I mentioned, has put together a framework of software as medical device classification. And that framework of software as medical device classification is basically looking at factors that are a lot more representative of the risk posed by such software. As you can see here, there's some examples of how the classification is affected. So whether, so looking at the criticality of the disease, whether the the disease condition is critical, serious, or non-serious, and whether the intended population is specialized trained users or fragile in respect to the disease condition. So once you've determined the software classification, obviously under the regulatory framework of the GHGF, as I mentioned before, one of the key elements is to comply with essential principles for safety and effectiveness. No matter if you're developing a software or hardware medical device, you still need to demonstrate compliance with those safety and effectiveness requirements. Obviously, essential principles have to be interpreted in the context of software. So we're not going to go through a very detailed review of what that means for every type of products, but essentially, essential principle number one, this is mapped, by the way, under the Australian regulation, would be looking at risk-benefit ratio for software as medical device. So here we're really talking about the risk of an inaccurate or an incorrect output of the software as medical device upon clinical management of a patient, for example, as opposed to physical interaction. Essential principle two would be really in terms of the reliance to current standards, and once again, the risk management program. And then we've got, mapped here essentially all of the other essential principles, and there will be some of those essential principles which may or may not be applicable depending on your device. Very unlikely would you need to obviously demonstrate compliance with sterilization or biocompatibility as they relate to obviously hardware devices. So it's going to be the case of reporting justifications for why that's not applicable to your products. There's obviously some of those essential principles which will need to be assessed on a case-to-case basis. For instance, essential principle number 5, which relates to the safety and performance of the device and not being affected by transportation and storage. So that's talking to things like how basically you'll be supplying your software as a medical device. Obviously, if your software is downloadable from a website, transportation and storage is not likely to affect the performance of your product. However, if your product is sold on a USB stick or a CD, these are the kind of things that you may need to consider. Similarly, so the best way to meet the essential principles is to utilize international standards or harmonized standards. So these are, once again, this slide is not intended to provide a complete mapping of all possible situations and the kind of standards that can be applicable in all instances to meet the essential principles. However, these are some of the key standards that may be useful in the context of software as medical device development. So for instance, when it comes to risk management, the 14971 is still the key standard to be followed. Usability engineering, obviously for software, given the risk posed by software interfaces and the kind of users that can interact with the product, usability engineering is going to be one of the key factors, and 62366 is one of the key standards to follow. Software development talks to life cycle, and we'll talk about that in a moment, with the key standard being 62304. Obviously, software are still subject to standard labeling requirements, and there are also sets of standards that cover these aspects. So I'll hand over again back to Yervant to talk about quality management systems for software as medical devices.
Thank you, Jean. Quality management systems is required by all regulators for the development, maintenance, and post-market activities related to software as a medical device. This slide shows a typical high-level process for development, release, and post-market activities in software lifecycle. The key point here is that QMS design processes need to be established prior to commencing any product development activities. The risk is if the determination of software as a medical device is not done up front, then the required processes will not be followed to ensure safety and efficacy, or the software may need to be updated to comply with the regulations. Depending on the jurisdiction where the software device will be marketed will determine the QMS requirements are applicable. There are accepted international standards and regulations which provide frameworks for implementing the QMS based on best practice. These include ISO 13485, which is accepted by Australia, EU, Canada. There's the US FDA 21 CFR 820, which is their regulations around quality management systems. Note, however, that US will be accepting ISO 13485 as soon as they work towards accepting it. There's also the MD-SAP program, which is a medical device single audit program that incorporates ISO 13485 and FDA 21 CFR 820 into a single audit. However, certain subsystems within a quality management system need to be interpreted according to the software lifecycle processes, as software itself has a unique development process. And the key differentiator within the quality management system for software is that there is no physical product being produced, and therefore the QMS production processes do not generally apply for software. The diagram on the right is from the IMDRF Software as a Medical Device and QMS Guidance N23. Shows various layers that relate to the quality management system and software lifecycle. It shows key processes that are required for an effective QMS, which include planning. As mentioned previously, development of lifecycle planning needs to be conducted within a QMS framework early in the development phases. You have things like organizational structure that provides leadership with adequate resources to ensure safety and effectiveness and performance of software. Design including verification and validation, which should be scalable for the type of software and the size of the organization, and takes in consideration important elements required to ensure safety, effectiveness, and performance. These include the assessment of software of unknown provenance also. Procurement and supply controls. In both outsourced processes and use of commercial off-the-shelf software, understanding, maintaining control, and managing the effect of such processes, activities, or products is important and necessary to deliver safe and effective software. This is crucial as the software developers more and more rely on either outsourcing the software development or integrating off-the-shelf software products into their code. Pre-market processes cover processes not mentioned before, such as issue management, configuration control, software release processes, CAPA, regulatory processes, document and records management, training, etc. And finally, post-market, once the software is produced and released, ongoing monitoring of the software in the field is required. And there's more on this shortly. As Jean mentioned, there is a dedicated standard for software lifecycle processes, which is the IEC 62304. It provides a framework that is required to be implemented within the software development lifecycle, including the processes, activities, and documentations that's required. It is based on a software risk classification, which is different to regulatory classification, yet have similar intent. There are 3 levels: A, which is low risk, where no injury is possible, up to C, which is high risk, where death or serious injury is possible. The IEC 62304 standard is mapped to both the ISO 13485 QMS standard and ISO 4971 risk management standard to ensure the safe development lifecycle framework addresses the requirements of each at every lifecycle stage.
Sorry, I just want to point out here that the extract that we've put on this slide is obviously from 62304. It's intended really to show mapping between the 62304 and the 13485. You'll note that given the date of release of 62304, it is not mapped yet to the latest version of 13485, but nevertheless, this shows how to implement some of the sections in the 62304 standard back into the common framework of quality management systems.
We thought we'd present some and briefly look at some key QMS lifecycle considerations. The next 2 slides will look at typical design development process as described in ISO 13485. and the FDA's 21 CFR 820. Foundational are the overarching quality management system standard, risk management, software development standards that I mentioned before. Though we have presented this sequentially, there are iterative software processes within some of the design implementation stages that should be factored, and overall we're showing a high level here. The key processes here are design planning, defining design input, and implementing the design to generate the design outputs. These are defined in IEC 62304 in detail and are developed based on standard software development processes. I just want to highlight specific considerations for software during the design inputs gathering phase, where specific requirements should be considered when defining the software requirements, such as user requirements, hazard analysis, the Australian European essential principles or requirements, privacy requirements, such as the US HIPAA and EU GDPR, cybersecurity requirements, usability and human factor requirements, and some specific guidances that should be considered, such as, for example, FDA's mobile app guidance. The development process continues into design verification and design transfer. Depending on the software is deployed, some qualification and infrastructure may be required. And design validation includes user acceptance testing or usability testing, and importantly, clinical evaluation. And Jean will discuss it in more detail shortly. And finally, once the software is deployed or released, the software lifecycle process includes software maintenance and post-market surveillance activities. Due to the nature of software, which is quick to develop and evolving, we thought best to spend a bit more time discussing the post-market surveillance or post-product release considerations. Due to the flexible nature of software, regulators expect the manufacturer incorporates mechanisms within the software to collect post-market surveillance data for analysis. Here are 4 key post-market activities we want to focus on. Issue management, covering processes for adverse event monitoring, complaints and recalls processing, problem resolution processing, information security or cybersecurity, covering processes for monitoring of vulnerabilities and threats, monitoring security within third-party software, patching and updates, software maintenance, standard software processes for managing user requirement changes and enhancements, third-party software changes, configuration changes such as platform or OS, and quality assurance built into software or defined processes to gather and analyze customer feedback, performance metrics, and quality metrics. During each of these processes, the risks and the clinical regulatory impact should be assessed for any impact on the regulatory status of the software to ensure that any issues, changes, and use of the software will continue to operate as intended and no new hazards arise that may direct or indirectly harm the patient. Now hand it back over to Jean, who will discuss the clinical evaluations.
Thanks, Yervant. Yervant has spoken about the post-market phase, and there are some implications into the nature of the clinical evidence and the way the data is gathered. So obviously, one of the things that we want to look into when we collating clinical evidence for software is the significance of the information that's provided by the software and its impact on the decision-making process. So for example, if the software is intended to inform clinical management only, as opposed to drive clinical management or to treat and diagnose, you'd anticipate that the depth and the nature of the clinical data that's collected for the software will be changed, obviously, as the risk of the product evolves. So this is one of the main deficiencies in supporting data that we can see in the field in terms of putting together the clinical evidence for software. As I mentioned before, because of the current state of the regulations and them being in a position of changing, sometimes manufacturers do not put together the right level of evidence to actually meet the intended use. let's have a look at the type of clinical evidence for software as medical devices. This extract is also taken from an IMDRF document. It's guidance document N41. They lay out 3 types of data that have to be evaluated to form together the clinical evidence. The first one is to put together the valid clinical association, and that consists of published literature and appraisal, comparison to a predicate, and if such data is not available, additional data analysis or if required, clinical trial. In the middle of the graph, you've got analytical validation, and that really relates to essentially your verification and validation testing for the software. And last but not least, obviously, the actual clinical validation, which in the case that the software is not supported by adequate predicate comparison or published literature, obviously the clinical data will need to be supplemented by potential clinical trials or usability evaluation, so actual user testings. So things that are common to software are the sensitivity, the specificity, confidence intervals, and so on and so forth in actually setting up clinical trials and comparing these to a baseline. So a very important factor is life cycle in software development. Software have that unique position of having the ability to evolve easily. Development cycles are fast, and there is a unique opportunity at the same time for software to collect use data in the field. So that's a unique advantage. This is something that should be built in and embedded in the software development plans. And at the same time, one of the challenges is to keep the scope of the software in line with the state of approval by the regulator or your clearance in the USA, for example, or in other jurisdictions, always true and in a validated state. So what that means is that through this post-market phase, as you review user feedback, complaints, adverse events, ways that the device is actually used, you'll be collecting this data, analyzing the data, and reviewing whether your clinical evidence needs to be supplemented or is still valid as it stands. You typically have 2 options there. Well, first of all, as you review this data, you need to see if the original intended use of the product is still valid or if this has to be modified. And then you've got an evaluation to be made as to whether you can actually maintain the current feature set, if you're required to deactivate features, or if you need to realign your claims, possibly submit regulatory applications to basically extend uses of the device. So that's sort of a unique scenario, even though all of the product changes always need, whether that's a hardware product or software, always need to be evaluated, and the need for regulatory submission has to be assessed. With software, as I mentioned before, given the development plans, given the ease of release of the kind of device, it is often something which is an issue. And which has to be thoroughly controlled and integrated in your development plans. So some of the key takeaways and conclusions of this presentation. So before we're moving to questions. So obviously the key differentiation between lifestyle software or a medical device is simply by comparing the intended use of the device with the medical device definition as it stands in the regulation. So this is really based on the intended use, feature sets, etc. The adoption of software as medical device in the regulatory framework is progressing. We presented some integration within the MDR. There's still, there's a number of guidance documents that are published by other regulators around the integration of software as standalone medical devices in the reg framework, but this harmonization is still not complete, and there's still some differences. Key guidance documents, we've presented 4 guidance documents that look at key elements of definitions, risk management, quality management system, and clinical evidence, help for interpretation and for a transition to new regulatory models. And we strongly encourage you to consult the IMDRF document if you're involved in software development, to make sure that all considerations and regulatory interpretations, are taken in consideration. QMS controls and lifecycle managements are essential. There's 2 key standards really which have to be integrated together. There's the 13485 standard, and obviously 21 CFR 20 if you're going to the US or MDSAP. But the important factor is to integrate the software development lifecycle, for example, in 62304 within your 13485 quality management system. So implement the design QMS processes early in software development lifecycle. Post-market monitoring, I think we stressed on that through the presentation. This is something which has to be continual and responding to changes. So, for example, aspects of cybersecurity, changes in platforms, changes to third-party software are the kind of factors that have to be considered on a continuous basis to evaluate the impact on your state of validation, but obviously also on the intended use of the product and on the nature of clinical evidence and regulatory clearances and approvals that you may be holding. And the depth and type of clinical evidence should be based on the significance of the information provided by the software as medical devices. So I suppose one word of caution at the moment, as I mentioned, in some of the regulatory frameworks, software as medical devices do tend to be low classified. This is not a reason to have a low level of clinical evidence. To facilitate the transition, you really need to make sure that you apply or you clearly evaluate the kind of disease that your software may be involved with, the type of users, the reliance on the data, and obviously investigate and evaluate the type and depth of clinical evidence that you have to put together in your technical file. So it's time for questions. So as I mentioned before, I'd like to thank again everyone who sent some questions ahead of time. We've actually received quite a number of questions, and we'll start to answer those ones. And hopefully address some of the points that were raised. So one of the questions that we received, and potentially 2 are sort of interrelated or talk to similar points. So how are cloud-based web servers and normative databases dealt with predictive classification algorithms treated? Or what about AI, and machine learning impact? So I guess, and we'll run this as a bit of a conversation with Yervant. I think, it's, first of all, it's difficult to answer in general terms, as it will all depend on the type of data that your software is generating. Obviously, the intended user of that data, the context of the use, but the key is whether or not it can influence or support the medical care. So whether you inform diagnosis or the treatment, then obviously it can be a medical device. Whether your device is a desktop product or whether it's web-based, whether it's a mobile app, they're all treated the same by the regulator. So long as they meet the definition of medical devices, you'd be subject to similar regulatory frameworks. And obviously, the kind of clinical evidence that you have to, receive, that you have to collect, has to reflect the risk profile of the device. Now, the interesting aspect is the evolving technology, as we mentioned. And do you want to?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's challenges will lie there. The machine learning and AI implementation works around a model that's implemented in the software. And the challenge is that that model changes over time. So, or on the fly within the model, within the software use. The key thing here is to focus on this life cycle management. In your planning, you define boundaries for that model, and you base your clinical evidence, your validation around those boundaries. And where you've realized that the model needs to be adjusted is when, as Jean mentioned before, you're part of your post-market activities. You monitor and you assess how it impacts on the clinical decision, and in many cases not necessarily have to advise or notify the regulators, but within the organization you can manage those changes, and there may be cases where your intended use may be impacted, and in which case you need to notify the regulators.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's we see more and more products that were originally intended, for example, for managing the hospital workflow, booking a patient, for consultations with a physician or entering basic data, etc. Those products don't necessarily form a medical device. Where that gets obviously a little bit complicated is when those software start to have active learning. Should some of that data be computed over time and start to actually affect the care plans for that patient? This is where you're starting to get into the boundaries of a medical device. And so what's absolutely fundamental is that as you actually collect data over time, you constantly reassess what's the current intended use of the device with this active learning. And if you actually evolve within the medical device category, then you'd be subject to the regulatory management framework. So that's something which, as we mentioned before, as you collect data over time, you really need to constantly reassess what that means, in terms of your regulatory processes, and whether or not you are obviously getting into the land of medical device, or whether you're still essentially a tool, to assist with booking or whatever the case might be. I think so. We had another question, or rather a point to be raised. So trying to gain an understanding of process frameworks that SaaS companies or businesses typically use. For example, waterfall or stage gate process. You want to add to that?
Sure. The regulations typically, focus on hardware devices. And it's has a traditional model for design processes, which typically a waterfall process. So our understanding of this question is how does the processes for, say, QMS apply to iterative design processes such as agile methodologies, and are they compatible with regulations? We've seen many companies receive approvals and release medical device software, standalone software using agile process. So it is possible. Actually, ISO 62304 in its appendix does cover how to apply iterative processes. So the crucial thing here is to understand and ensure you have total coverage of your validation activities. I understand that Agile includes user stories which are fed in by your design inputs, and you may have system or high-level design inputs, and you can go through the Agile process, and at the output of the software build, you can do a validation or verification exercise to test the overall software. So that are typical kind of approaches used.
Yeah, I completely agree. So obviously, because of the time at which the regulations were written, and there is obviously I wouldn't want to say a preference, but the waterfall model is a more traditional way of demonstrating. However, you know, as Yervant has mentioned, Agile is compatible with those methods. I think the key in a regulatory application is to clearly demonstrate through your documentation that you've got full coverage of validation activities.
Yep, that's right.
So at the end of the process, if you can demonstrate that all of your inputs have been met, you know, whether you've used a you know, an agile methodology or a more conventional way of design and development, both would be satisfactory. You just need to show that you know, all inputs and the full coverage is provided, and that your verification and validation activities are complete. Any differences in registration if software is provided as part of the device or as a standalone product? Okay, so in terms of that question, so it's really the case of asking what is the medical device. So if the medical device incorporates the software and the clinical function is basically provided by the combination of software and the hardware, then the classification of medical device will apply to the entire system. If the medical device is the software app and that provides essentially a clinical function, then that's a standalone software. It's a medical device in its own right, and therefore has to be classified, you know, as a product in its own. So, yeah, everything to do with, you know, in terms of applying essential principles, clinical evaluations, and QMS processes would be following the types of guidance that we've provided through this presentation. We also had a question: how much did mobile app development and public cloud service change the regulation and implementation of data privacy and development? Do you want to?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, we've seen, as John mentioned, that software technologies are you know, evolving in an incredible pace, and the regulators are always playing catch up with these advances and changes. When a new regulation is typically implemented, it goes through some public consultation, and we provided some examples of where TGA in Canada are at the moment. And it allows an opportunity for industry to provide feedback and influence the regulation. So it's important as industry, you go and look at these consultations and provide feedback to the regulators. As mentioned, Europe has put software as a medical device specifically and clarified its definition and classification in the medical device regulations. And so we can see there's work done towards that. As you know, we provided some guidance, in the IMD RF guidance documents in the webinar. And I think there was a question about the data privacy as well, that they are separate regulations to medical device regulations, but if you hold any privacy, any information, public information within your software, then those regulations apply to your product and must be considered during the software development process, as we mentioned before.
Yeah, completely agree. The next question we actually received as part of this webinar: would a clinical decision support software be considered as software as medical device? Well, I think we partially answered this question as part of the presentation. I think you know, the short answer would be yes. However, you know, this is something we need to investigate on a case-by-case basis. What is the kind of data that's provided? Who's the final user of this data? What is the kind of what's the outcome of the use of the information provided by the software as medical device? If this is information that is used for you know, lifestyle configuration, lifestyle you know, you know, benefits, that's not necessarily going to become a medical device. If it's, however, informing you on certain disease states or treatment plans, and therefore affects an actual clinical decision, then you would likely be considered a medical device. Okay, we've got another question. How much does it cost for an organization with less than 50 employees to obtain an ISO 13485? Okay, so this is a bit of a difficult question to answer because it will depend on the course that you actually obtain from the certification agency. Look, typically, first of all, you need to consider the cost of development of your quality management system. This is a process that takes time and resources. And obviously, you know, this is something which has to, you know, to be implemented prior to envisaging a certification. Should you go for a certification, I don't want to be quoted on this, but say typically we've seen prices around 35,000. It's about that range, 35,000 Australian dollars. So once again, I mean, we don't actually certify in-house. We provide consultancy. So these are the kind of questions, you know, which would need to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. You need to shop around, go to certification agencies, select a reputable agency, and you know, and see what makes sense for you. Okay, so well, we hope that we've provided some lights on the topic of software as medical devices. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this webinar, for joining us today. If there's anything that comes to mind at a later stage, please don't hesitate to contact us. We have a lot of resources that are accessible and free from our website on brandwoodckc.com. We can also be reached on LinkedIn through our company LinkedIn or our personal LinkedIns. We have YouTube channels and a lot of, as I mentioned, resources on our website, including this blog. Thank you very much for your participation today and the very good questions, and we look forward to helping you out again in the next month and the next webinars. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.